terms of the superlatives that my father mentioned, you have to realize he's not objective. But yeah, there's many aspects of art that we could talk about in connection with the collection. Maybe I will, for those of you that are less familiar with the collection, give kind of a little bit of broader context of what the collection's focus is and what this period of art, how it's described as being, and then talk a little bit about a more narrow subject that we thought would be curious, unity in color, unity in space, unity in form. So I studied in Russia and did my master's degree there in visual arts, and when I completed my studies, we started organizing exhibitions of my work, some of the colleagues I studied with, and my teachers' works. And those initial exhibitions were quite successful, and then we expanded to include the works of my teacher's teacher, my teacher's teacher's teacher, their colleagues, their friends. Something very unique happened in Russia in the kind of first quarter of the 20th century, when you had the abstract expressionism movements beginning. In fact, some of the very first abstract artists were in Russia. Artists like Malevich and Tatlin, they were what we call suprematists. And so the first kind of non-figurative works started there, and partly under the patronage of Lenin during the revolution. And the idea was to create a new art for a new society and to make a break with the past. But when Stalin came to power, and for the record, I'm not a Stalinist. I do not condone Stalin's activities, but there were some interesting aspects to an otherwise horrific leader. And one of the interesting aspects was, when he came to power, he tried to bring back the classical art tradition. He took the teachers from the Imperial Academy, that were the great masters from the 19th century, and reinstated the Art Academy in St. Petersburg under the name of the Rapin Academy, and in Moscow as the Surikov Institute. And his logic was interesting. It was similar to the Renaissance painters of the 15th and 16th century that used painting as a way to communicate to people. He said this very abstract work is actually more elitist than the paintings that came from the previous period, which were of subjects that people could identify and connect with. And if I want to be able to have influence on the people, then we need to be showing them something that they can connect with and emotionally relate to. So this might not have been only for the love of art, because there was something that we called social realism, where you had a woman with big biceps extremely happy to be riding the tractor into the field to collect her cabbages. Or men that were so elated to be pounding metal in a metalworking factory for 18-hour days, right? So, but this social realism was only one side of that period. There was an incredibly strong foundation of education that was created, and the artists that were the most gifted, the most talented, and that had the right connections were able to paint, the entrance to their home, or lilacs picked that morning, or a portrait of their loved ones. As long as they were not painting subject matter that was challenging for the regime, be it something that was overtly capitalistic or religious or anything else that didn't fit into the Soviet mentality. If it was just private life and everyday life, then they had relative amount of freedom. And the commissions that were made by the state were the ones that were more social, what we call social realism. And the interesting thing is, when I was studying at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, I was looking for a deep understanding of representational painting. I didn't want to be mystified when I went to a museum and was looking at a self-portrait of Rembrandt or a landscape by Sisley. I wanted to understand how this was being created. And fortunately or not, the way things developed in Western Europe and in America, there was a break. There was this understanding in the beginning of the 20th century that realism wasn't relevant anymore, that the official institutions embraced abstract expressionism. That led to many other isms. Then you ended up with conceptual art, installation art, performance art, all these different aspects, which is fine. And there's a space in the world for all these various kinds of art. But the art of standing in a field and seeing how the field recedes and how the cupola of the sky parallels that, and feeling the temperature of the color and the vibration between the colors of the field and the sky became a lost art. There's certain things you can't learn from books and from museums, that is passed down from master to disciple. The man that I studied with, Vyacheslav Zabelin, could trace his lineage back to the mid-18th century of master-disciple over more than 8 different generations. And I want to talk a little bit about what is that is difficult to learn from books or to try to recreate, no matter how talented you are. What are those evasive, elusive qualities that you need a master in order to impart on a student, for him to be able to impart on the next generation? One of the things that I found fascinating was this question of unity. When I started studying in Russia, at the Surikov Institute, one thing that was interesting was they said the eye of the camera exaggerates proportion, exaggerates contrast. How many times have you seen a beautiful sunset and you try to take a photograph of it and it doesn't have that life? It almost looks just like 2 tones. All those gray tones and mid-tones get lost, right? Or, for instance, if I was going to take a picture of these 2 ladies right here, Susan's head would be this big and Debbie's would be this big, right? And yet when we look at them, their heads are more or less the same size, right? That exaggerated perspective is also part of the fisheye lens of the camera. If you look at Degas' works, for instance, his series of ballet dancers, the floor looks pregnant. No one could dance on that floor, they would fall over. That was because he was using photographs as a reference. You also can see in his paintings of jockeys that the horse that's close to him is this big and the horse that's probably 10 feet away is itty bitty. We don't see the world that way. Our eyes compensate space in a very different way. So I wanted to share a couple of stories of how I was taught. Zabelin, my teacher, painted this, and many other paintings in the gallery, all the ones in the stairwell. And he said that light unites. Where you have light, you can have different shifts in hue. You can have different shifts in the temperature of color. And he said that shadows are not darkness. Shadows are full of reflected light. And so in a painting like this, for instance, you can break it down into basically light and mid-tone, right? So you have all these different colors through here, throughout the mid-tone, and whether it's a tree, it's a building, it's asphalt, or it's the bark of a tree, you more or less have one tone, with gentle, subtle shifts of hue in between. And likewise, the light is united, from the light on the tree here, to the light on the building, to the bits and pieces and highlights of the light on the grass, or the entranceway. And when we were painting portraits or figures, he would say that the darkest dark on the side of the light will always be lighter than the lightest light in the shadow. Light organizes things, okay? And there's a certain unity to this. We can also talk, maybe this is one of my paintings, and since I'm your speaker today, I thought it'd be curious for you to see one of my works. But here also, light is unifying, whether it's a tree, or it's a path, or if it's a shirt on a person, or the sky. The light has a unifying element to it, okay? And the midtones are the same, and even in the darkest darks, they are still reflecting light. Think of the cupola of the sky is a gigantic lamp. Everything under that lamp is going to reflect in one way or another the light, right? There is no darkness outside. And one of my teacher's teacher was a man named Konstantin Korovin. And when he would take his students out to the field, he had a stick with a piece of black felt on it, and he would hold it up and say, look through the blackness of the felt. And he had the blackness of the felt was an interesting fabric because it didn't reflect light. And then you can tell if you're looking at the black felt and look at everything else at once, you can see what you thought was darkness, how light it is. Now, it's human nature, at least today human nature, that we look and focus on different points in space. If you're in a landscape and you were looking at, for instance, this place here, you would think, my God, the brightness of the light, and it's dark here, and you would make it very, very strong contrast. But also, our minds have been programmed to see things more in a way that a video camera, a film camera, or whether it's analog or digital, doesn't matter, it's still a camera lens, which is very different than the human eyes. First, we have two, not one. Now it's complicated because modern iPhones might have 3 or 4 or 6, so I'm going to have to rethink some of my theories. But basically, the way we see receding space and the way we see proportion is based on a perfect equilibrium between an absolute vertical and absolute horizontal. And we can base everything else, whether we're going downhill or uphill, whether we're standing straight up or falling over, based on our correlation to that perfect cross inside of our mind. That's where we find the horizon, right? And when my teacher was trying to teach us, his disciples, to see through and not look at. To see through means when you're looking at a landscape, you feel, whether or not you can physically see it, maybe there's buildings or trees in your way, but you feel where the horizon is, and everything else is going to be either lower or higher. Imagine the ellipse of a cup or a glass. The closer it comes to eye level, the more you'll just see a line. The lower it goes, the more it opens up on one side. The higher it goes, the more it opens up on the other side. The landscape is built from the same principle. One of my teachers told me, if you can learn to draw a matchbox on a table, then you can draw anything. But a matchbox that's actually sitting on a receding horizontal plane. Not a matchbox that's dipping down into the table, not slightly levitating, not one that only has one corner, a matchbox flat on a table. If you can learn to do that, you can draw anything. And unfortunately, this kind of rigorous training in the way of using our eyes has not been taught in Western countries for already multiple generations. But it's an important part of learning if this kind of art matters to you. And I would say even knowing about it helps us appreciate art when we have art in our homes or art in museums, of understanding how it's built. The more we know, the more we can appreciate the beauty and the craft and the knowledge that's behind it. So how does this apply to color, for instance? This focal vision is important. Like I said, if you're looking at a part of the landscape and it looks like a really intense contrast, and you look at everything at once, or you look through the black felt, you realize it's not as much a contrast as what you thought. The same is true of color. Once I was painting a nude in the 5th course at the Surikov Institute, and it was a big painting. It's hanging in my restaurant in Kaheti. For those of you that have been there in Georgia, maybe you have seen this nude. And it was a young lady sitting on a cloth, and it was not an important cloth. It was just this kind of grayish cloth that was around as a drapery used with models. And she was on the background of this green and purple tapestry. And I've been working for about 2 months on it. And my master, Isabellen, came in, and he put his arm on my shoulder, and we all had a little bit of trepidation when he came in because we very much admired him, and we wanted to please him and wanted to be also pleased and feel the pleasure of pleasing him. And he came and he said, Starik is what he called me, old man. He said, old man. He said, the figure is beautiful, and the vibrations between the color of her body and the background is beautiful, but that cloth she's sitting on, you can't figure it out, can you? And if you looked at it, the paint was really built up on the cloth where she was sitting. Everything else was this beautiful, almost gem-like translucent layers. And I was really frustrated because every time I tried to get that cloth, I couldn't figure it out. And the more frustrated I got, the more I focused on that place. The more I focused on that place, the more I couldn't see its correlation to everything else that was around. There's many parallels. We could talk about this in private life, or we could talk about this in terms of understanding what's going on in our minds, or we could talk about this even in cooking. But the more I looked and abstracted the cloth from its greater environment, the more difficult it was for me to see it. And he came up and he said, open up your eyes wide so that you can see 180 degrees. When you wiggle your fingers, that you can feel their presence. Be able to see both corners of the room. Don't look at the cloth at all, but in the corner of your eye, feel its presence. And I did this, and he said, what color is it? I said, it has this golden hue. And he said, well, then why were you painting it the color of slate? And he whacked me on the back of the head, and he said, don't look at what you're painting. See through. And this is there was multiple lessons like this where once you start focusing, and it especially happens when you're painting, and when you're starting a painting, it's easier to kind of see the big picture. The more you start to go into detail, the more you start to focus, the more we might be tempted to look at a point in space. Another story, he told me, also we were painting nude in the studio, and this woman that we were painting had particularly dark eyes and fair skin. And so the contrast seemed to us really great and intense. And he comes in and he's like, oh my God, what are you guys doing? He said that, does she have eyes or does she have pieces of coal? And she said that you're painting her eyes as if they were the inner side of the wall of a cast iron stove, full of soot. How could you be so vulgar? And we're thinking, oh my God, what do we do? And he said a very interesting thing. He said that contrast, if you want to find the energy and vibration, is not about how light and how dark it is. It's about building a chord, a tension that vibrates in a certain way. And he said, if you're using natural light, on most occasions, the lightest light will be the inner part of the bread, and the darkest dark will be the crust of the bread. And he said, within that octave, you'll find everything you need. As soon as you go beyond that octave, you're extracting it from reality, and it's not going to feel real, it's not going to feel, it will feel artificial. And you see this especially in very well-intending plein air painters today. They see light and they go for cadmium yellow, cadmium orange, white, let's pump it up. It's like, look at that light. And then you look at the painting when you bring it in and you see yellow paint. You don't see any light. This is a painting that I think describes that very well, the idea of the inner part of the bread versus the crust of a bread. This is painted by Nikita Fedosov, one of our favorite painters and a painter very much featured in our collection, who happened to be one of the best friends of Zavelin. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to meet him. He passed away 2 years before I came to the Academy. But you can imagine the feeling of that long evening light, how bright it must have been, how much temptation there could have been in an artist that uses their eyes more like a photograph rather than this peripheral vision, to pump up that contrast, to build up really, really dark and really, really bright. But here, in this subtle shift of tone, the chord that's built, we feel the warmth of that evening light. It's light, it's not paint. It's light. And I think that the unity here, basically you have the half tones of the hay in the field, you have the half tones in the trees, you have the silhouette of the trees against the light of the sky, united with the light falling on the haystacks and on the building. I mean, if you look at the shift between the light here in the hay and the light on the cabin, it's the same tone. It's two different hues, right? This is an incredible example of unity. This is a painting by another peer, Sergeyev, and you can see also the unity to the forest, how instead of getting caught up in distracting details and seeming contrast, when you look at everything at once, you can get to the gist of the situation. And there's more paintings throughout the gallery where you can apply and see what I'm talking about when I finish. But look for how the artists use light, color, and tone in order to create unity. In this case, for instance, you have the light pouring in to frescoes in a church on Rostov the Great. And the halftones, the reflected light, the direct light, it doesn't matter if it's purple or blue or yellow or green. It matters, is it a halftone, is it a shadow, or is it light? Light, or the absence of it, or the reflection of it, unites. And we can say the same thing when it comes to space. Let me shift this now. So, maybe we'll talk about this one here. So often, even in artists in some of our greatest museums, you will see water that is not a receding plane. And yet, lakes, rivers, and seas, for the main part, are receding planes. There might be waves, there might be ripples, but it's a big receding plane. The sky is parallel to that plane. And yet, even some of the most celebrated artists, I could tell you, there is no receding plane. And you can see, I was just recently at the Virginia Museum and was talking with my friends there and pointing out these ideas of space, and there are still lifes with tables that an apple couldn't sit on. The apple would roll off it, right? There are skies painted like wallpaper, when the sky is also full of space. Portraits of people that seem to be well-intending artists, where you only see a mask. You don't feel where the head goes and the back. If you look at a Rembrandt, you can feel the back point of the skull. He was so focused on form. So I would say that just like in color, just like in tone we can find unity, there's also unity in form, whether it's the plasticity of the human figure, or whether it's how we look at receding planes. You can see a lot of 20th century well-intending artists in realism will paint a corner of a room that is obtuse, that's open. And yet, of course, you can have an old building or cabin that maybe the foundation has sunk and it's not perfect, but most of the corners of our homes are actually 90-degree angles. The only way we don't see that 90-degree angle is if we're looking at it. Which goes back to seeing through, not looking at. And I think that this idea of unity is quite important. And I bring this up because I also, having grown up in the US and studying at a US art academy, when I went to Russia, my Russian was decent. I had to take 6 years of aesthetics, the philosophy of beauty, in an oral exam a few days after I arrived. And so my Russian was good, right? But when they kept saying this word selness means unity. I was thinking, why do they keep saying that? What do they mean? And they would, come and say that I put a light part of the shadow too bright, or a dark part of the shadow too dark. And I was always trying to bring back in the values closer together. To bring it into music again, having it all be within an octave. And then you can get even more subtle, the microtones or the overtones, the vibrations between colors. When I was working with Zabellen, and he was trying to teach us how to feel color, he said, color is not something that you paint the local color. What you paint is a combination of colors that vibrate in a way that gives us a sensation of the life that we're looking at. And again, you can paint a rose against its green foliage with the brightest pink that you can buy on the market, and it just looked like paint. And you can build a color chord that has temperature and tone that vibrates in a similar way to the way you feel the rose there that radiates light. And I don't know if it's making sense. If I had a brush in my hand and was painting, maybe I could do a better demonstration. But this question of unity you can see in just about every work in this gallery. If you look at here, for instance, how the shadow combines the cabin with the foliage. It doesn't matter if it's a leaf, or if it's wood, or if it's a gutter, or if it's a fence, or if it's the halftones and the shadows of the grass. It's all one tone, right? And then the same thing is true whether it's the bark of the birch tree, or the top of the roof, or the lilacs. They're shifting colors, but it's not, there's very little to no contrast in tone there. The young lady sitting in a meditative pose. Look at all those beautiful halftones around. I would tell you that 99% of modern plein air painters would have painted that with a much greater contrast. And it's a contrast that's similar to the way the camera eye works, not the way the human eye works. And this element of subtlety can be very exciting in food, in wine, in music. Think about the fugues of Bach, right? There's no huge contrast in its tonal range, and yet there's an incredibly poignant passion and tension built in the notes. If you look at the lilacs, it's another example. This, talking about different works, so you can know it's not about an interior or a landscape or still life. It's about a way of seeing, a way of using our eyes in a more wholesome way. So here, even the shadow of the lilac itself, its leaf, or the shadow of the wall behind it, or the stool that it's sitting on, is the same. Now, if you are going to go learn textbook perspective, then these lines shouldn't be going like this. But actually, when you're standing above, looking at it and looking at everything at once, they, on the contrary, open up. It's the same thing. How do we use our eyes? And those lilacs in that basket are sitting on that stool, and you can feel the space between us and the stool, between the stool and the basket, and from behind the basket to the wall. We feel the space even in the parts that we can't see. And I think I think this, not to downplay the beauty or potential beauty of photography, it's a separate art form. But if we want to understand why art for a couple thousands of years shared a certain principle of understanding, whether it's the cave paintings from Lascaux, France, all the way up to the Impressionists, then it's important to understand how are they using their eyes, and how is that different than the way we see the world today. This is important if we want to try to paint in this language. It's important if we want to be able to fully appreciate and understand these works. So I will be here for another hour or so, as long as the exhibition goes on. If anyone has any questions now, I could take a couple, or you can come and see me during the duration of the exhibition. Yes, sir.
Mark Rothko,
Yes.
what kind of light do you see in his abstract painting?
So it's a totally different visual language. So I think that for me, in Rothko's works, there is a lot of emotion and there's a lot of spirituality and there's a lot of beauty. But it's for me, painting was considered historically color, form, line, composition, content, idea, all of that together, the sum of it was called painting. If we talk about Velázquez, if we talk about Pissarro, if we talk about Millet, if we talk about Piero della Francesca. In the beginning of the 20th century, it was like unraveling a ball of yarn where Cy Twombly said, I only am interested in line. Rothko or Joseph Albers said, I'm only interested in color. Joseph Beuys said, I'm only interested in the idea, the concept. So what was once whole became unraveled. And whether or not that's a good thing or not, we can have different opinions about that. But from the point of view of feeling color, I get pleasure looking at Rothko's paintings, but I miss all of the rest. I miss the structure, and I miss the complexity of a more multifaceted expression. Any other questions? I answered all the questions you had about unity and art. Yes, sir.
I heard you refer to music as something like you're discussing. Do you see any similar characteristics in the new digital music compared to the original sound, live, and the need that's in between for vinyl?
Yeah, on an emotional level, the kind of warmth of vinyl, I don't know, maybe I'm very old school. I mean, I make wine in clay pots. I went to Russia to study art. I like a lot of traditional things. There's a certain warmth for me that I associate with a vinyl recording that even when CDs came out, kind of felt like something more cold or more processed. And certainly in terms of musical traditions, I think there's minimalism in music that is similar to what we could talk about, if we have anything from a folk song by Bob Dylan or a opera of Monteverdi, there was content, there was subject matter, there was rhythm, there was melody, you had all these different elements. And some modern music today seems to have also unraveled in a similar way where it's mainly just about rhythm. Or, but I think this idea that there's a dialogue from all these different complex parts that creates an energy, we can parallel the way we cook a dish, the way we make music, the way we paint paintings. At least it's possible to make parallels. In my mind, the way I think about it, it's that way. And one other thing my teacher said once about peripheral vision made an interesting comparison. He said that there were Native American Indians that had a practice of when they were hunting, they did not look at the animal they were shooting at. They had an open 180 degree gaze, and if a deer ran here or here, they could quickly move and shoot it because they saw the whole range. Whereas the modern day hunter looking only sees what he's looking at that point, abstracting it from space. And it's exactly the same point. If you want to see the correlation of color, if you want to see the receding planes of space, if you want to see how much contrast there actually is, how warm or cool a color is, feel the vibrations between colors, how big or small is something. Basically, everything I learned from my teachers at Bellin in terms of how to see and that transfer to how to feel was using a peripheral vision and trusting what you felt without processing it through your preconceptions. I think our preconceptions are maybe the greatest demon to being able to see in a pure and deep way. And I think if we enjoy the complexity of minerality and acidity and fruitiness in our wine, and we don't want to unravel that, then it's okay to have a painting that has color, space, composition, and content, and we can look at that in a similar complex way.
One last question.
Yes.
What favorite painting, artist, or both?
Fedosov is probably one of my favorite artists, and I can explain why. This is one of his works. This is one of his works. We have probably 50 or 60 in this building alone. I studied art history for more than 8 years, formally. Informally, I never stopped. And when you study art history, we're told that there are classicists and there's romanticists. That the romanticists are all about emotion. The classicists are about logic and linear thought. And I always thought, why can't we have both? Why can't we be thinking and feeling beings? Why can't we have emotion in our art, but also paint it with attention and knowledge? And for me, Fedosov, and there's a beautiful field, those of you that can see it in that room, has an emotional charge in his paintings, and yet the color, the tones, the half-tones, the receding planes, everything that I've spoke about in unity, here comes almost in one breath, almost like he couldn't see any other way. And I think that tension between understanding the world with feeling and emotion, but on the skeleton and backbone of knowledge and linear thought, is very exciting in food, wine, painting, and music. Okay?
Thank you.
I take it correctly, unless you think it's something